The man who entered room 214 at Toronto General, just after midnight, had once been a good officer. That was before Pinnacle Care Group began paying his monthly retainer. His name was Adrian Kemp, and he carried himself the way men do when they have learned to stop asking certain questions about the work they are paid to do. He had been told the woman in the bed was heavily sedated. He had been told she wouldn't remember anything. Clearly, he had been told, and this was the part he had accepted most easily, that what he needed to take from that room was just a tablet, a device. Nothing personal, nothing that mattered, really, to anyone except the people who had sent him here. Kehinde Osagie was not sedated. She had not slept in any meaningful sense since the night 3 days earlier when a black SUV had crossed 2 lanes of the 401 and pushed her vehicle into the concrete barrier at 110 kilometers an hour. She had been conscious the whole time. She had heard the sound of the impact the way a person hears it when their body understands something their mind hasn't caught up to yet. A deep, structural wrongness. The kind of sound that takes weeks to stop hearing in quiet rooms. She lay still now, her breathing controlled, her eyes closed, every muscle in her body deliberately softened to imitate rest. She had learned this particular stillness during the years she spent sharing a bedroom with 3 younger siblings in a Scarborough basement apartment, where quiet was the only privacy available to any of them. She had never unlearned it. Adrian moved to the table beside the bed. His fingers found the tablet in the dark. "That one's a decoy," Kehinde said. She didn't open her eyes immediately. She let the words settle first, the way a person does when they want the other person to understand that what's coming next will be unhurried. Adrian went still, the tablet in his hand. When she finally opened her eyes and looked at him, she didn't reach for the call button. She didn't raise her voice. She studied him the way she had spent 20 years studying spreadsheets, looking for the pattern beneath the surface, the number that didn't belong, the line item that suggested something had been changed after the fact. "Mr. Kemp," she said, "Harlow Bennett told you I'd be unconscious." The color left his face in the way that happens when a person's entire understanding of a situation collapses at once. He asked how she knew his name. She told him she had known it for 11 days, which was 3 days longer than he had known hers. Then she gestured toward the chair beside the bed and told him he might as well sit down, because neither of them was going anywhere for the next little while, and standing in the dark, holding a tablet that contained nothing useful to anyone, was a strange way to spend a Tuesday night. Adrian did not sit, but he did not leave. The hospital corridor outside was quieter than corridors usually are during the day. Nursing stations have rhythms, and anyone patient enough to learn them can predict the gaps. Kehinde had learned this one in the first 48 hours of her stay, not because she was paranoid, but because she was the kind of patterns, even when her left arm was in a cast, and her ribs made breathing complicated, She had been expecting someone since yesterday morning. What she had not expected, she would admit to herself much later, was how ordinary he would look. How much he would resemble the kind of man who sits across the table at a quarterly review and nods at the right moments and collects his fee without flinching. She had built her company, Osagie Analytics, from nothing, from a single laptop and a rented desk in a shared workspace on King Street West, and she had sat across from many such men in many such rooms. She knew what they looked like when they believed the situation was still under their control. Adrian Kemp looked like that now, though the tablet in his hand was working against the impression he was trying to make. She told him to check the drawer in the small table to his left. He didn't move immediately. The instruction felt like a trap, and he had enough instinct left to recognize the shape of one. She waited. He opened the drawer. Inside was a single page, printed, dated, signed, that outlined the exact nature of the arrangement between Pinnacle Care Group and a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. A corporation whose beneficial owner, after enough layers were peeled back, was Harlow Bennett himself, the same man who sat on the board of 3 Ontario health charities and had his photograph taken annually at the gala for the Trillium Foundation. Adrian stared at the page for a long time. Kehinde watched him stare at it and understood, in the way she always understood things about people, before they understood them about themselves, that he was doing the math. Calculating the distance between the man he had been when he retired from the RCMP with a commendation and a handshake, and the man currently standing in a hospital room at midnight, holding evidence that connected his most important client to fraud. That isn't the original, she told him, and it isn't the only copy. She had not come to this hospital planning to win a confrontation. She had come because the alternative was bleeding out on the 401, which would have been inconvenient for a number of reasons, not least the fact that she was not finished yet. 3 months earlier, she had been sitting in her office on the 22nd floor of a building overlooking Lake Ontario, reviewing a routine data migration project for a client in the long-term care sector. The work was ordinary, the kind of project her company handled dozens of times a year. Cleaning up databases, standardizing formats, making sure the numbers that went in matched the numbers that came out. Except in this case, they didn't. The discrepancy was small enough that an auditor doing a casual review would likely have passed over it. A billing code applied to services rendered in rooms that Kehinde's own data showed had been unoccupied. Dates that didn't align with admission records. A pattern of charges, physiotherapy, occupational support, recreational programming, logged for residents whose files indicated they had been in palliative care or had already passed away by the time the services were supposedly delivered. She had flagged it internally first, the way a careful person does. She had asked questions through the right channels, in the right tone, giving the client every opportunity to explain themselves. The explanation she received was a phone call from a man who identified himself as Pinnacle Care Group's general counsel, who told her in a voice that was professionally warm and functionally threatening that the discrepancy she'd identified was the result of a data entry issue already under internal review, and that her company's involvement in the matter should extend no further the migration and submitting the final invoice. Kehinde had thanked him for the clarification. Then she had gone home and spent the next 6 weeks rebuilding the dataset from scratch. What she found, working alone during hours she kept off her regular calendar, was not a data entry issue. It was a system. 87 facilities across Ontario and 2 in Alberta. Billing inflated over a period of 9 years. Charges submitted to provincial health programs for services never provided to residents who, in too many cases, had not received adequate care in the final weeks of their lives. The money moved through a series of management fees and consulting contracts that eventually resolved and which connected to a holding company, which connected to another company, which connected. After enough patience, to the man whose face appeared on the cover of Business in Vancouver 3 years running, she also found something harder to document but impossible to ignore. A pattern in incident reports. Deaths recorded as expected, natural causes, standard end of life, that occurred in clusters, in facilities where staffing records showed coverage levels far below what regulations required. She could not prove with the data alone that neglect had caused those deaths, but she knew enough about numbers to know that the pattern was not random. And she knew enough about the world to understand what it meant when a pattern like that kept appearing in the records of facilities, serving people who had no one left to advocate loudly for them. She had taken everything she had to a contact at the Ontario Securities Commission, a woman she had known since their days at the Rotman School of Management, who had listened for 3 hours, and then told her, very carefully, that what Kehinde had compiled was significant, but that it would need to be handled through proper channels, which meant it would need to be handled slowly. 2 weeks later, Kehinde's car was pushed off the 401 near the Mississauga interchange at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night. The driver of the black SUV did not stop. The police report filed the following morning attributed the incident to a possible impaired driver, though no other vehicle was identified. Kehinde read the report from her hospital bed and noted three things. The officer who filed it was not the one who had spoken with her at the scene. The description of her vehicle's damage was inconsistent with a simple side impact, and the section where witness information would normally appear had been left blank, though she had a clear memory of two other drivers who had stopped and spoken with the paramedics. She had been in this situation before, not physically, not like this, but in the essential shape of it. She had sat across from people who controlled rooms and watched them try to use that control to make her doubt what she already knew was true. She had done it at bank meetings where the numbers in her business plan were solid and the man reviewing them needed her to believe they weren't. She had done it in boardrooms and on phone calls and in emails written in the careful language of people who want to threaten you without creating a record of the threat. She was not easily made to doubt what she knew. From the hospital, working on her own phone and the second tablet she had kept in her overnight bag, the one nobody had known about, she had spent the first 2 days of her recovery distributing what she had compiled. A full copy went to Fatima Diarra, the civil rights lawyer in Ottawa, who had been fighting Pinnacle's employment practices in court for the past 4 years and who had her own reasons to want the financial records examined carefully. A second copy went to a journalist at the Globe and Mail whose coverage of Ontario's long-term care sector, Kehinde, had been reading for months. A third copy was encrypted and stored on a server, with no connection to her company's systems, set to release automatically if she did not enter a specific confirmation code every 72 hours. She had not told anyone about the third copy, not because she was theatrical about it, but because the value of a failsafe is that it functions without requiring anyone's cooperation. Adrian Kemp set the page back in the drawer. His voice, when he spoke again, was quieter than it had been. He asked her what she wanted. She told him she didn't want anything from him specifically. She told him that what she wanted was an investigation that didn't disappear into a drawer somewhere, and that whether he helped or hindered that process would determine a great deal about how the next several months of his life looked. He started to say something about orders, about not having known the full picture when he accepted the assignment. Kehinde looked at him for a moment before responding. She said that she understood that was probably true, and she said it in a way that made clear she didn't intend it as a comfort. The door to the room opened before either of them could continue. Harlow Bennett did not look like a man who orchestrated fraud. He looked like a man who raised money for hospitals and received honorary degrees from universities and was photographed at ski chalets in Whistler with people who ran provincial ministries. He was 61 years old, and he had spent 4 decades cultivating the appearance of a person too successful to be afraid of anything. He looked at Adrian first, and something in his expression shifted. A recalibration, the adjustment a person makes when they arrive expecting one kind of room and find another. Then he looked at Kehinde. "You're supposed to be resting," he said. Kehinde looked back at him, without changing her expression. "I am resting," she said. "I'm just doing it while listening." She reached beneath her pillow without hurrying and set a small recording device on the surface of the blanket. It had been running since Adrian entered the room. It was, she explained, without any particular inflection in her voice, the third such device she had in the room, placed at different angles because she had learned long ago that redundancy was not paranoia. It was just good data practice. Bennett's jaw tightened in a way that was barely visible, but not invisible to someone watching for it. He said that she had no idea the complexity of what she thought she'd found. That what looked like fraud from the outside was a set of decisions made under regulatory pressure that she, as someone who dealt in data rather than operations, could not fully appreciate. Kehinde let him finish. Then she said that she had spent 9 months going through his operational data very carefully, and that the residents of Pinnacle's facilities in Sudbury and Thunder Bay and Brampton, who had died on nights when his company's staffing records showed no licensed nurse on duty, did not die because of regulatory pressure. They died because it was cheaper for them to die than for Harlow Bennett to staff his facilities adequately. The silence in the room after she said, "That was the kind that takes up physical space." Bennett moved toward the bed. His voice dropped in a way that was meant to feel dangerous. He told her she had one opportunity to be sensible about this. Adrian Kemp, standing behind him, took a step back. Kehinde did not move. She told Bennett that the opportunity he was describing had passed approximately 71 hours ago, at which point the failsafe she had set had begun its countdown. She told him that in approximately 40 minutes, unless she entered a confirmation code she had no intention of entering, a complete copy of everything she had compiled, including the financial records, the staffing logs, the incident reports, and a detailed account of a meeting that had taken place in his Bay Street offices 9 days before her accident, would be transmitted to 4 recipients, 2 of whom worked in departments of the provincial government that his lobbyist had not managed to reach. She said it the way she might explain a straightforward data migration process to a client who had never worked with large datasets before. Clearly, without emphasis, because the information itself did not require drama to be what it was. Bennett stood very still. She told him that leaving the room would not change anything, and that staying in it was already making things considerably worse, and that the most sensible thing he could do, the word he had used, was to wait for what came next. He didn't sit, but he didn't leave. There was a sound in the hallway, not the usual sound of the nursing shift. A specific footstep, too, then a pause, and then the door opened again, and Dr. Ingrid Carmichael, the attending physician who had been managing Kehinde's care since the night of the accident, stepped into the room and took in the scene with the particular expression of someone who has seen enough unexpected things in hospital corridors to remain functional in the face of them. She asked, in a voice that was very calm and very clear, who had authorized these individuals to be in her patient's room after visiting hours. No one answered. She told Bennett and Kemp that they had approximately 30 seconds to step into the hallway before she called security and documented their presence in the patient's medical record, which was a formal hospital document, which meant it could be subpoenaed. Bennett reached for words that didn't come. Carmichael had known for 2 days that something was wrong. She had noted it first in the way certain questions about Kehinde's condition had come through administrative channels rather than medical ones. Questions about discharge timing, about sedation levels, about whether the patient had been asking for her personal devices. They were the kinds of questions that sometimes came from concerned family members, and very rarely from anyone else, and they had not come from Kehinde's family. She had documented her observations in the patient file. She had also called a colleague, a healthcare investigator who had spent 12 years examining long-term care complaints for the provincial ministry, and mentioned, in general terms, that a patient in her care appeared to be under pressure she couldn't account for medically. That call had been made yesterday afternoon. The people who needed to know were already moving. Adrian Kemp walked into the hallway without being asked twice. He stood there for a long time beneath the flickering fluorescent light that maintenance had been meaning to replace for 3 weeks, and he thought about the commendation he had received 22 years ago, and what it had said about his character, and whether any part of that character had survived the years between then and now. He thought it had, just barely. He took out his phone. Bennett was escorted from the room by security at 12:47 in the morning. He left in the way that men who have spent decades controlling rooms always leave when control is removed from them. Not with anger, but with a terrible stillness, the kind that comes from a person who doesn't yet understand that the version of himself who walked in no longer exists on the other side of what just happened. The documents reached their recipients at 1:03 a.m., 17 minutes ahead of the failsafe scheduled transmission, because Kehinde had decided, at some point during the conversation with Bennett, that she didn't need to wait. The Ontario Securities Commission opened a formal inquiry 48 hours later. The Ministry of Long-Term Care issued a statement the following week announcing an independent review of Pinnacle Care Group's operations across the province. A review that would ultimately take 19 months to complete and would result in the largest regulatory action in the ministry's history. Bennett's lawyer issued a statement calling the allegations politically motivated. Nobody in particular seemed persuaded by it. Adrian Kemp gave a voluntary statement to investigators that was, by all accounts, thorough in a way that surprised people who had known him during his years on the Pinnacle retainer. He described in specific detail the nature of the instructions he had received, the name of the person who had given them, and the full sequence of events inside room 214 on that Tuesday night. He described Kehinde Osegi as the calmest person he had ever encountered in a situation designed to make someone afraid, and he said it not as a compliment, but as an observable fact, the way a person reports something they witnessed. The families of residents who had died in Pinnacle facilities began to receive letters from ministry investigators in the months that followed. Letters asking them to come forward, to share what they remembered, to give their account of the care their parents and grandparents had received in the final weeks of their lives. For some of these families, it was the first official correspondence they had ever received, acknowledging that their experience might have been something other than ordinary loss. Kehinde testified before a legislative committee in the spring. She wore a navy blazer and spoke for 4 hours without notes, answering every question in full, without hedging, and without the particular kind of careful language that signals a person is trying to say something while leaving themselves room to unsay it. A committee member asked her, near the end of the session, why she had kept working on this when the people opposing her had so much more to lose, and therefore so much more incentive to stop her. She thought about it for a moment. She said she grew up in Scarborough in a house where nothing came easily and where her mother worked 2 jobs to keep 4 children fed, and where the word can't was treated with deep suspicion. She said she had built a company from a laptop and a borrowed desk, and that at every stage someone had tried to tell her that the room she was standing in wasn't meant for her, that the data she was looking at meant something different than what she could see with her own eyes. That she should be grateful for whatever she'd been given and stop asking inconvenient questions about the gap between what was promised and what was delivered. She said she had never found that convincing, not in business and not in this. The committee member nodded, and the room was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with formality. Dr. Carmichael's documentation of the irregular administrative inquiries into Kehinde's care became part of the formal record. The hospital updated its protocols governing third-party access to patient information, a small procedural change, PAS typed into a policy document that would be read at orientation sessions for years to come, in a room that would never know the name of the person whose situation had made it necessary. Fatima Diarra expanded her case against Pinnacle's employment practices to include the financial evidence Kehinde had provided, and the combined proceeding moved faster than anyone in her office had expected. She said afterward that she had reviewed thousands of documents in her career, but that she had never seen a dataset compiled with that level of care by someone working alone, during lunch breaks and late evenings, while also running a company with 40 employees and a client list that didn't stop growing, just because one of those clients had tried to have her killed. The word killed was deliberate and accurate, and nobody challenged it. On the afternoon that Kehinde was discharged from Toronto General, she walked down the corridor past room 214, now occupied by someone recovering from cardiac surgery who knew nothing about what had happened inside it 4 weeks earlier. She walked past the nursing station, where Dr. Carmichael was updating a chart, and looked up long enough to nod once. The way you nod at someone whose steadiness in a difficult moment you will never forget, and probably will never fully be able to thank. She walked out into a March afternoon in Toronto, which is the kind of afternoon that doesn't offer warmth so much as a provisional truce, the light pale and clear and carrying no particular meaning except that it was there. There was no one waiting with cameras, no statement to give on the steps of the hospital, none of the architecture of a moment that announces itself as significant. She stopped for a second on the sidewalk and thought about her mother, who was still in Scarborough and who had driven to the hospital every day during the first 2 weeks, parking in the lot that cost $18 for the first hour and bringing containers of jollof rice that the nursing staff pretended not to notice. She thought about the first time she had understood what data could reveal. She had been 14 years old, sitting in a public library with a card she'd applied for herself, pulling statistics on why certain Toronto neighborhoods had worse health outcomes than others, staying until the librarian had to ask her to leave. She thought about that girl, and she thought about the woman she had become. And she understood, standing on the sidewalk in the thin March light, that neither version of herself had ever believed that staying quiet was an option worth taking seriously. The investigation was still ongoing. Some things had been resolved. Others would take years. Some names had not yet appeared in public filings. Some parts of the system that had allowed Pinnacle to operate without adequate scrutiny for nearly a decade were still being examined by people who would not finish their work quickly. But the evidence had left room 214 in the early hours of that Wednesday morning, and it had gone to people who were not under Harlow Bennett's reach, and it had done what evidence does when it reaches the right hands at the right time. It had made the silence impossible to maintain. Kehinde pulled her coat closed against the cold and walked toward the parking lot where her sister was waiting with a thermos of tea and absolutely no interest in discussing anything that had happened in the last 4 weeks until Kehinde was ready. She had spent years building something from nothing, and she understood that the most important thing she had ever built was not the company, or the dataset, or the failsafe that had worked exactly as designed. It was the habit of refusing to look away from what the numbers were actually saying. No matter who was in the room, no matter how much easier it would have been to simply let them say something else. They had walked into that room believing she was already finished. She had used every minute they spent believing that to make certain they were wrong.